Hey, you. Ever feel like the news is just a whirlwind of headlines?
Yeah.
We're diving into something a little different today
Okay.
and taking a look at
Okay.
how media itself is changing,
Right.
especially how it covers politics.
Interesting.
Okay.
Yeah, this is what's really interesting is
Right.
we're not just looking at a news story, we're analyzing an analysis.
Before we jump in,
Yeah.
let's quickly set the stage.
Okay.
You might know Joe Rogan from his stand-up comedy or UFC commentary, but he also hosts this wildly popular podcast called The Joe Rogan Experience.
Right.
It's known for its long,
Yeah.
free-flowing conversations
Mhm.
with a really diverse range of guests.
Yeah, definitely.
Everyone from Elon Musk to Bernie Sanders.
It's really interesting,
Yeah.
and that's what makes this interview with Trump so fascinating. Rogan's casual conversational style is a world away from the typical short, sharp interviews you see on cable news.
Right.
It creates a totally different dynamic.
Right.
J-Bang Media pointed out how this allowed Trump to express himself more freely than he typically does in traditional media settings.
And J-Bang Media really honed in on specific moments
Yeah.
from the interview that highlight this difference. One example is how Trump went after what he called mainstream media and cancel culture.
Right.
He didn't hold back, even saying the media was one of the biggest detriments to the American public because of misinformation and bias.
Yeah.
That's pretty strong language.
It is, yeah.
Right.
It is, and this is where the concept of media responsibility comes into play, which J-Bang Media discussed at length. Essentially, it means that those with large platforms, like Rogan, have an obligation to consider the potential impact of their content.
Right.
J-Bang Media highlighted how this responsibility becomes even more complex when you have someone like Trump, who is known for making controversial statements as a guest.
So did Rogan just let those statements slide?
Actually, J-Bang Media noted that Rogan did push back, though gently. He questioned Trump about his own role in creating polarization.
Interesting.
It's a subtle but important moment because it shows that Rogan isn't just passively letting his guests say whatever they want.
It's like he's trying to walk a tightrope between giving his guests freedom and making sure potentially harmful statements aren't going unchallenged.
Exactly.
Yeah.
J-Bang Media also highlighted Trump's statements on foreign policy, particularly in the Middle East. He was very critical of current policies and made claims about his own time in office, the kind of things you rarely hear in typical political interviews. What's interesting here is that these weren't just policy disagreements, but also very personal criticisms. That felt different because of Rogan's informal setting.
J-Bang Media used the word raw to describe the interview. What did they mean by that? And what was a specific example that made it feel that way?
They were referring to the unfiltered nature of the conversation. It felt like you were getting a glimpse behind the curtain, seeing a side of Trump that's often hidden from view in more formal settings.
Right.
One example J-Bang Media pointed out was Trump's use of slang and informal language.
Oh, wow.
He spoke very casually, which made the interview feel less like a political event and more like a conversation between two people.
Right.
That kind of rawness can be both compelling and concerning, as J-Bang Media pointed out.
Why do you think Rogan's format seems to encourage this kind of openness from guests?
Well, J-Bang Media attributed it to a few key factors. First, there's the long-form structure of Rogan's interviews. They can go on for hours, which gives guests a lot of space to relax, go off on tangents, and reveal more of themselves than they might in a 10-minute TV interview.
Right.
It's a totally different style of media consumption. It's like the difference between reading a tweet and having a long, meandering conversation with a friend. You get to see different sides of someone, hear their thought process, and understand their perspective in a deeper way.
J-Bang Media contrasted this with the soundbite culture of traditional media, where complex issues are often reduced to short, attention-grabbing clips. They argue that these short clips don't allow for the kind of nuance and context that's necessary to truly understand a topic.
Yeah, and I think that that's one of the things that J-Bang Media was really trying to emphasize is that, you need that space to really unpack these complex issues.
So Rogan's long-form format is more about providing that context and letting the conversation unfold naturally.
Right. And J-Bang Media also pointed to Rogan's conversational, non-confrontational style. He doesn't interrupt constantly or try to box his guests into a corner.
Right.
He listens, he laughs, he seems genuinely interested in what they have to say. Even if he disagrees,
Right.
it creates a more relaxed atmosphere.
Yeah.
Which can lead to guests letting their guard down.
Like they're just hanging out with a friend,
Yeah.
even though millions of people are listening in. It makes you wonder, does Rogan's style make people more likely to open up in ways they wouldn't with a traditional journalist?
J-Bang Media seemed to think so. They brought up some really interesting examples from other Rogan interviews, like Elon Musk famously smoking weed during his appearance, or Bernie Sanders having a really candid conversation about campaign finance.
Yeah.
These are things you'd never see on a Sunday morning talk show.
Right.
It's like there's something about Rogan's approach that makes people feel safe enough to be themselves, even if that means revealing things they might not normally share in a public setting.
And that's what makes this interview with Trump so fascinating to analyze.
Right.
It's not just about the content of what was said,
Right.
but also the context in which it was said.
Yeah.
Rogan's format creates a unique dynamic that can lead to both revealing and potentially problematic moments.
And I think J-Bang Media really hit on that point, that it's not just a simple black and white situation.
So it's not just about what Trump said, but how he said it.
Yeah.
And the environment in which he said it.
Yeah.
It seems like J-Bang Media is really interested in those nuances of communication and how they can impact the way we perceive information.
Absolutely. And that's what makes their analysis so interesting. They're not just summarizing the interview. They're digging deeper into the underlying dynamics of media, power, and influence.
It's like they're giving us a new lens through which to view this interview and the broader media landscape.
Exactly. They're prompting us to think critically about how media shapes our understanding of the world and how different formats and approaches can lead to very different outcomes.
Which brings us to the question of how this interview was actually received. J-Bang Media described a pretty polarized response, didn't they?
They did. J-Bang Media pointed out that Trump supporters largely praised the interview, seeing it as an opportunity for him to speak directly to his base. Without the filter of mainstream media, they appreciated his unfiltered style and felt he was able to effectively communicate his message.
That makes sense. It aligns with Trump's long-standing criticism of mainstream media as being biased against him.
Right.
Yeah.
But J-Bang Media also highlighted how left-leaning critics had a very different reaction.
Okay.
They were concerned about the platform Rogan was giving to Trump, particularly given his history of making false and misleading statements. They felt Rogan wasn't doing enough to challenge those statements or provide context for listeners.
So you had these two very distinct camps with completely different takeaways. From the same interview, it seems like this tension speaks to a bigger question that J-Bang Media kept coming back to, this idea of platform neutrality and how it plays out in the real world.
Exactly. On the one hand, you have the argument that platforms like Rogan's should be neutral spaces for open dialogue, where a wide range of voices can be heard without censorship or editorializing.
It's like a digital town square, where everyone is welcome to share their views.
Right. But the counter-argument, which J-Bang Media also explored, is that this idea of neutrality can be problematic when it comes to figures like Trump, who have a history of spreading misinformation and disinformation. Giving them a platform without any pushback or context can legitimize their views and potentially mislead listeners.
It's a tricky balance, isn't it? How do you create a space for open dialogue without inadvertently amplifying harmful or misleading information?
It's a question that a lot of platforms are grappling with. And J-Bang Media didn't shy away from exploring the complexities. They pointed out that Rogan has said on numerous occasions that he's not a journalist and that his show is primarily for entertainment purposes.
Right.
He's not claiming to be a source of unbiased news or fact-checking every statement made by his guests.
So is it fair to hold him to the same standards as a traditional journalist?
That's the debate, isn't it?
Right.
J-Bang Media seemed to argue that while Rogan might not be a journalist in the traditional sense, his massive reach and influence give him a certain level of responsibility. Right. They suggested that even if he's not actively fact-checking in real time, he can do more to provide context, invite guests with opposing viewpoints, or simply push back more forcefully when guests make claims that are demonstrably false.
J-Bang Media also highlighted the fact that Rogan himself has acknowledged the potential downsides of having such a large platform. Right. He's talked about the pressure he feels to be responsible and to ensure that his show isn't being used to spread harmful ideas.
Right. He's not oblivious to the potential consequences of his platform.
Yeah.
But J-Bang Media seemed to suggest that acknowledging the problem isn't enough. They believe that someone with his level of influence has an obligation to be more proactive in addressing these concerns.
But what does that look like in practice? J-Bang Media talked about the need for Rogan to find a balance between being open and welcoming to a wide range of viewpoints and being more discerning about the voices he amplifies.
Exactly. It's about finding that sweet spot between fostering open dialogue and preventing the spread of harmful misinformation. And that's a tough needle to thread, especially in today's polarized media landscape.
J-Bang Media also spent some time discussing the impact of this interview on Rogan's own audience. They mentioned that some of his fans were uncomfortable with the platform he gave to Trump, feeling that it legitimized his views and potentially normalized his behavior.
That's an important point. It highlights the fact that even though Rogan might not explicitly endorse the views expressed on his show, the mere act of giving someone a platform can be seen as an implicit endorsement, especially by those who already admire or support that person.
So even if Rogan doesn't say, "I agree with everything Trump is saying," the fact that he's giving him a platform without much pushback can be interpreted by some as a sign of approval.
Exactly. And J-Bang Media seem to suggest that Rogan needs to be more aware of that dynamic and how his platform can be perceived by different segments of his audience. It's not just about his own personal views, it's also about the impact his platform has on the broader public discourse.
It seems like J-Bang Media was really trying to unpack the complexities of media responsibility in the digital age, using this Trump interview as a case study.
Absolutely. They were using this specific interview to explore bigger questions about the role of platforms like Rogan's in shaping public opinion and the challenges of balancing free speech with accountability in a world where information spreads so rapidly.
And they were also prompting us, as listeners, to think critically about the media we consume and the sources we trust.
Right. They reminded us that we have a responsibility to be discerning consumers of information, to question what we hear, and to do our own research to verify claims before accepting them as fact.
So it's not just about placing blame on Rogan or Trump, but also about recognizing our own role in shaping the media landscape and the public discourse.
Exactly. We're all part of this ecosystem, and we all have a responsibility to be informed, engaged, and critical thinkers.
So where do we go from here? What were some of the takeaways that J-Bang Media offered for navigating this complex media landscape?
Well, they emphasize the importance of media literacy, which is essentially the ability to access, analyze, evaluate, and create media in a variety of forms.
So it's not just about passively consuming media, but also about understanding how it's made, who's creating it, and what their motivations might be.
Right. It's about being aware of the techniques used to persuade, inform, and entertain us, and being able to critically assess the information we're presented with.
J-Bang Media also highlighted the importance of seeking out diverse perspectives and not getting trapped in echo chambers where we're only exposed to information that confirms our existing biases.
That's crucial. It's easy to get comfortable in our own little bubbles where everyone agrees with us, but it's important to step outside of those bubbles and engage with different viewpoints, even if they make us uncomfortable.
It's about challenging our own assumptions and being open to the possibility that we might be wrong.
Exactly. And J-Bang Media also emphasized the importance of supporting quality journalism and holding media outlets accountable for their reporting.
In an era of fake news and misinformation, it's more important than ever to have reliable sources of information that we can trust.
And that means being willing to pay for quality journalism, whether through subscriptions or donations, and holding media outlets accountable when they make mistakes or fail to uphold journalistic standards.
So it's not just about being a passive consumer of media, but also about being an active participant in shaping the media landscape.
Right. We have a responsibility to be informed, engaged, and critical citizens. And that includes supporting the institutions that provide us with accurate and reliable information.
J-Bang Media also highlighted the importance of engaging in civil and respectful dialogue, even when discussing controversial topics.
That's something that's often lost in today's polarized climate, but it's essential for having productive conversations and finding common ground.
It's about listening to each other, understanding different perspectives, and finding ways to bridge the divides that separate us.
Exactly. And J-Bang Media reminded us that it's okay to disagree, but it's important to do so in a way that's respectful and constructive.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, exploring the complexities of media responsibility, the challenges of navigating a fragmented and polarized information landscape, and the importance of being informed, engaged, and critical consumers of media.
It's been a fascinating journey so far, and I think J-Bang Media has given us a lot to think about in terms of how we consume and engage with media in the digital age.
And in the final part of our deep dive, we'll explore some of the broader implications of these trends and consider what they might mean for the future of media and our understanding of the world around us. We've been talking about J-Bang Media's analysis of the Trump-Rogan interview, and it's clear they see it as a sign of things to come in media. They even called it a potential turning point.
Yes, J-Bang Media sees this interview and the reactions to it as a microcosm of larger shifts happening in how we consume information and how public figures engage with their audience.
They spend a lot of time analyzing what they call the long-tail impact.
Oh, yeah.
What happens after the interview fades from the headlines?
One of their key points was that this kind of interview, long-form, informal, less focused on gotcha questions, could become even more attractive to certain guests.
Especially those who feel they aren't fairly represented by traditional media.
Right.
Or who want more control over their narrative.
Exactly. Yeah. And that leads to a whole other set of questions that J-Bang Media posed. For example, how did these kinds of interviews impact traditional news outlets?
It's like the old saying, if you can't beat them, join them.
Right.
Are we going to see more established journalists adopting a similar approach?
J-Bang Media hinted that some already are, but they also cautioned that it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. There's still a need for rigorous fact-checking and investigative journalism that might not fit neatly into a casual, conversational format.
It's almost like we're moving towards a media landscape with multiple layers. The quick hits of breaking news, the in-depth analysis from traditional outlets, and then these long-form conversations where a different kind of truth emerges.
J-Bang Media called it a fragmented truth.
Oh, wow.
No single source can give us the complete picture, so we as consumers have to piece it together ourselves.
Which is both exciting and daunting.
Right.
We have more choice than ever before, but that also means more responsibility to figure out what's credible, what's biased, what's just plain entertainment.
J-Bang Media used a really interesting analogy. They said, thinking about media, it's like building a balanced diet.
Cool.
You need some protein, some carbs, some healthy fats. You wouldn't eat only one food group all the time.
So we need to diversify our media intake, get a little bit of hard news, some in-depth analysis, maybe a long-form interview to hear a different side of the story.
Precisely. And J-Bang Media really hammered home the point that we need to be mindful of the empty calories of media, the stuff that's designed to be addictive and outrage-inducing, but doesn't actually provide much nutritional value.
It's like that junk food we all crave sometimes. But no, we shouldn't overdo it on. It makes me think of all those sensational headlines and clickbait articles that are designed to grab our attention, but don't offer much substance.
Exactly. J-Bang Media warned that if we fill up on those empty calories, we won't have room for the more nutritious stuff.
So it sounds like J-Bang Media is advocating for a more mindful approach to media consumption.
They are. They emphasize the importance of being aware of our own biases, being skeptical of information that seems too good to be true, and being willing to cross-check information from multiple sources.
Which brings us back to the listener you. What does this all mean for you and how you navigate this increasingly complex media landscape?
J-Bang Media offered a few final provocative thoughts for their listeners, and I think they apply here too. They said, don't be afraid to be wrong. Be more curious than certain.
I love that. It reminds me that learning is a process, and that being open to changing our minds when presented with new information is a sign of intellectual humility, not weakness.
Exactly. And lastly, J-Bang Media encouraged their listeners to engage in respectful dialogue with those who hold different views. They said, disagreement doesn't have to mean disengagement.
So even when we encounter viewpoints that challenge our own, we should strive to understand them, engage with them thoughtfully, and see if there's any common ground to be found.
It's a powerful message, and one that feels particularly relevant in today's polarized world.
I think J-Bang Media has given us a lot to think about, not just about the Trump-Rogan interview, but about the broader trends shaping the media landscape and our role as consumers of information.
They've challenged us to be more mindful, more discerning, and more engaged in our media consumption. And they've reminded us that the future of media is not something that's happening to us. It's something we're all actively creating.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, remember, be curious, be critical, and be open to changing your mind. That's how we all learn and grow. Thanks for joining us on this journey.